And well, the talk was really interesting and nice. And जैसा कि कहते हैं कि आज में जीना ज़रूरी है, लेकिन कल को भी याद रखना ज़रूरी है. So it's always good to remember our past, good to remember history. And after 1 minute of short break, we are going to talk about homelands, identity, nationalism, and belonging. Well, the next topic, which is identity, nationalism, and belonging, is the most hot topic currently in the media and everywhere around us, in social media and everywhere. So I hope and I think that this is going to be one of the most interesting sessions which we are going to witness today. Apart from that, I have one question for all of you present here. Are you guys hungry? Because if you are, we have food stalls out there and a lot of other stalls. We have Sasha, Art of Misanthropy, Karma Kettle, True South, Chabar, Taifu, Flurries, Kamunda, Noodle Doodle by RB, Expect Amazing, The Art Loom. And we also have stalls like Oxford Bookstore, Shri Book Center, Neogi Books, PlayStation, Apne Aap, AMRI Hospital, Global Reach, Reserve Bank of India, and Iris. So everyone, if you are hungry or if you want some TP, as in time pass, so you can definitely go around, visit those stalls, and check out the stalls. So we'll start shortly in about a minute with our next topic, which is homelands, identity, nationalism, and belonging. Ready for our next event, which is homelands, identity, nationalism, and belonging. So as we all have been following news, social media, and various other platforms, we definitely know that this is the topic which is the current heartthrob of the whole nation. So let's see how the talk goes about. So for this talk, I will request Samrat Choudhury. Samrat Choudhury is a journalist and author. He currently edits the Mumbai edition of the Asian Age. He's co-editor of Insider Outsider, Belonging and Unbelonging in Northeast India, and The Urban Jungle was his first novel. Can we have a round of applause for Sir? We have Bronwyn Fredericks. Bronwyn Fredericks is a researcher and author with over 30 years of experience working in and with the Australian universities, state and federal governments, and indigenous community-based organizations. She is current Pro-Vice Chancellor at the University of Queensland, Australia. We also have Carlo Pizzati. Carlo Pizzati is a seasoned journalist who has worked for over 16 years for the Italian national daily newspaper La Repubblica, corresponding from Rome, New York, Mexico City, and Madrid. We have Saira Shah Halim. Saira Shah Halim is an educator, writer, and poet, theatre personality, corporate trainer, and a social activist who's actively involved with causes such as gender equality, justice, and women's issue. And for the moderator, I would request Saaz Aggarwal with a double G to please come up. Saaz Aggarwal is a contemporary Indian writer whose body of work includes biographies, translation, critical reviews, and humor columns. Her 2012 book, Sindh Stories from a Vanished Homeland, established her as a researcher in Sindh studies. So can we have a big round of applause for our guests here? So now handing over the mic to Saaz Aggarwal.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all here. Thank you so much, Maina and the AKLF, for putting together this session on Homeland, which is such an important topic. It's important to each one of us because we all know what it's like to miss home, to be away from home. And it's personally very important to me because that's one of the things I write about. And of course, it's extremely important in today's political context. So we're going to start with a round of introductions. I'm going to request each one of our panelists to say who they are and tell us a little bit about the work that they do.
Well, I'm a journalist and author. I used to be the editor of the Asian Age in Bombay, but I've quit, so that I'd like to clarify. The most recent book that came out, which I had a part in, was this one called Insider Outsider, and it's subtitled Belonging and Unbelonging in Northeast India, and it's about the issue of exactly that, belonging and not belonging in Northeast India. It is directly related to the issue of the National Register of Citizens and the Citizenship Amendment Act. Although when we started work on this book in 2016, we did not know that this is where we would end up.
So I'm Bronwyn Fredericks, and I've been introduced to start. Thank you. I really appreciate the invitation to come to the KLF to speak today. I do have Indigenous Australian ancestry. I'm an Indigenous Australian woman. I'm very keen and publish around issues to do with Indigenous rights in Australia and campaign on that, including the current issues around constitutional reform and the Uluru Statement and reconciliation within the university and more broadly. And I have written in the health domain as well as in other disciplines as well, both poetry. I do have a book published along with essays and other papers. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, AKLF, Maina Bhagaddi, Anjum Apa, and the entire team for having me over yet again to speak at the lovely festival that you all are enjoying. So today's topic is really interesting, it's close to my heart. We're going to talk about nationalism, identity, as well as homeland. I think all of us have gone through this moment where we actually start questioning what is home. So today we are actually at that crucial junction. As you see, in India is in the midst of turmoil. We are fighting a divisive law that is passed in India. We are contesting it in the apex court. So a little bit about me. I won't waste too much time in introductions, but I have about 16 years of corporate experience in learning development roles. And then I moved on to work for gender equality, social justice. I write on policy and governance as a political columnist. And I'm also a national media panelist on political and social issues in the national media. Thank you.
Hello, hello. Thank you for being here, first of all. And thank you, Maina Bhagat and AKLF 20. Thank you to the Italian Consulate for having me here. I was asked to prepare a 2-minute introduction of myself, which is totally related to the topic at heart: identity, homeland, belonging. I'm a journalist, I'm a professor of communication, but who am I? What is my identity? I can tell you I was born in 1966 in Geneva, Switzerland. I thought it was a great start, an international city with a United Nations in it. But unfortunately, at 20 days of age, I was brought back to my father's hometown, an hour north of Venice, in a valley which has the highest percentage of priests, nuns, lap dance bars, suicides, and alcoholics. So I guess you can understand why, when I turned 16, I was happy to take a chance as a foreign exchange student to move to America. Great, right? But instead, I ended up near southern Alabama in Pensacola, Florida, where in high school I had a student next to me with a KKK ring, and the abortion clinic next to my college was bombed a few times, and there were some serial killers on the rampage, killing people and sometimes eating them, like Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy. So I got out of there very quickly, and I moved to Washington, D.C., just to discover that D.C. stands for doesn't care. And then I moved to New York, where I graduated at the College of Journalism at the Columbia University, and I started working for La Repubblica, an Italian newspaper. And I was in New York for another 6 years. 11 years after being in the States, I moved back to Italy, to Rome with La Repubblica. Then I was asked to move to Mexico, where I worked for La Repubblica there and had some adventures as a foreign correspondent. Buenos Aires, Madrid, back to Italy, working as a talk show host and starting a website. I finally stopped, started writing novels, started writing memoirs, movies, after being a talk show host on live national TV, briefly. And this is when I landed in India in 2008. This is what my book is about, is how I first arrived in India, bending over backwards, the journey to the end of the world to cure a chronic backache, and to discover an identity, my new Indian identity, which I talk about in the previous memoir that came out last year, which is called Mapile, which means son-in-law in Tamil, because I've been living in Tamil Nadu for the last 10 years.
Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you, that was lovely. So I'm going to start with asking you, Samrat, to tell us about your work. Now, I went through parts of this book, and one of the things that I read is that you have written about Assam and about the Bengalis and Assam, and I want you to tell us something about that. But I also want you to, what I noticed was that one of the things that you said, which we all probably know is true, is that this whole displacement business in India is rooted in 1947, in the partition of India, and a lot of very complicated things happen. You mentioned that both Bengal and Punjab were partitioned, and Sylhet was never partitioned. So there's a Sylhet story which is quite separate. And I was particularly interested in that because my work, a large part of my work, I should say, is to do with the Sindhi community. And the Sindhis come from a place called Sindh, which is now entirely in Pakistan. And the Hindus are all over the world. They don't have a homeland. They've just kind of made homes wherever they are. And one of the things I'd like you to tell us is what you think makes the Sindhis different from other communities that you've studied.
We don't really have a lot of Sindhis in Northeast India, but there are some.
Please start with your work and then tell us about the Sindhis once, we've got a sense of what your work is about.
Yeah, but of course there is a sort of a similarity in the sense that there is a story of displacement, and in the case of Northeast India, when you talk about the Bengalis especially, it's a complicated history. You know, the interrelationship between the Assamese and the Bengalis is a fraught one, I have to say. There have been riots going back to 1960 at least, and probably even before that. And the current tension that you see in Northeast India and especially in Assam over the Citizenship Amendment Act is actually related to that. And so too was the previous exercise of the National Register of Citizens, which, as you know, happened only in Assam so far. If you look at the protests which are happening around the country now, the protests in Northeast India have a very different character to the protests elsewhere in the country, because the protests in Assam, for example, and elsewhere in Northeast India, while they're very strong, are only against the Citizenship Amendment Act and not against the National Register of Citizens. Now that is interesting because, after all, Assam is the place where 1.9 million people are out of the NRC. So how is it that the only place which has gone through this exercise is not protesting it and is only protesting the CAA? To understand that, you have to go back into this history of fraught relationships, the insider-outsider dichotomy in Northeast India, and also to think about how insiders and outsiders are defined. Now, unfortunately, what has happened is that the idea of homeland has come to mean ethnic homeland. So it is defined purely by ethnicity, and it is understood in purely exclusive terms. So it is evident in some instances even in the names of the states. So for example, Nagaland, the land of the Nagas, Mizoram, which means effectively the same thing, the land of the Mizos, from which yesterday, today's papers, if you pick up today's newspapers, you will see that there has been a settlement signed yesterday in which Bru refugees who had been evicted from Mizoram more than 20 years ago have been resettled. How is it that there are thousands of people, more than 30,000 people who were evicted? They're tribals, both, it's inter-tribal. evicted from Mizoram, ended up in Tripura, and were internally displaced, living in refugee camps for all of these years. What's going on there? So it's related to the idea of ethnic homeland. So basically, in short, to understand all of this, you have to go back to how these borders and identities were constructed, and to look at also the partition of Assam, which is forgotten. The partition of Bengal is known, the partition of Punjab is known, but there was a partition of Assam as well, and that is forgotten. And these are things which have to be understood before what is happening now can be understood. As far as Sindhis are concerned, I'm sorry, we don't really have a Sindhi population really in our part of the country, so I don't really know too much about the Sindhi experience, as it were.
So your work is with the indigenous peoples of Australia. So I was wondering whether you could tell us something about the common history that we've had, India and Australia, and if you have an idea of how the settlement of the situation of the indigenous peoples is similar or different.
I think, am I on? There's some commonalities in terms of the imperialism or colonisation processes to both from Australia as well as India. However, some of the processes, how they were implemented, are very different. So here we just heard about how tribal people were evicted and moved on. Yes, that's right. In Australia, tribal people or indigenous people were also forcibly removed from parcels of land and put into other places. There are still people who still live in the places where they were forcibly removed to, who are still trying to claim their homelands back. So we have that under what we call the land rights movement or the land, action movement around that. There's huge amount of actions around that. When we talk about citizenship, there's issues around citizenship because in Australia we only had campaigns in the 1960s, of which at that point in the 1960s, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were awarded citizenship. Up until 1967-68 when it was enacted, there was not a process of citizenship for all Indigenous people. There were pockets of where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people had the vote. Not all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander didn't vote. There were pockets where there were people who voted. However, the majority did not even have the vote in Australia up until 1967. So we need to look at it in that contrast around that. There's also issues of poverty, issues of access to power. And we talk about leading up in the next week. On the 26th of January, you may see a bit of advertising here. I don't know how much you see from Australia. But certainly at home right now, they're starting to talk about the 26th of January and the celebration of a nation. That is the day that Australia celebrates in some sectors its Australianness. But it also is a day to question, what is it about Australia that makes it Australian? What is it about us? And there's some of us here today that we would identify as Indigenous Australians or Australians, and there's others we'll just say we're Australian people. So, or we live in Australia. So what is that makes us? What is it when Australia talks about multiculturalism, or how do all people try and fit together? Because there's many cultures in Australia, just like there are many cultures in India now. There are many histories. But one thing, in Australia, there are 95% of all the people that control businesses, institutions, big government departments, and 100% that control universities are from the dominant culture, are Anglo origin. So therein hence is a problem. We can talk about how we want to have inclusion and multiculturalism and Indigenous people and some forms of, integration or inclusion or recognition of Indigenous rights. But there's also issues then around how you change that balance of the dominant culture controlling everything. So yesterday, myself and the two authors that are here in the front row, Professor Dr. Anita Heiss and Lisa Heike, and you'll find their books over there in the Oxford Bookstore shop, and they are available here for signing as well. We were downtown, not far from here, and we witnessed the Women's March yesterday, and witnessed that power within that Women's March. And I reflected last night about how women march at home, how I've been part of marches of women, men and children, both Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people together campaigning for rights. And so there's commonalities, even why people were protesting yesterday about the issues of citizenship, about the issues of refugees, of religious freedoms that we have at home as well. People are campaigning at home for the rights of religious groups, of Muslims, of Buddhists, of all kind, Hindu people, all kind of people, to practice their spirituality and their religions at home and their cultures, including Indigenous people and our rights, to practice indigeneity in all of its forms, and for Indigenous people to revive and revitalise our cultures in all of those forms as well.
Thank you so much. We'll pass on now to Carlo. And all of you heard him introduce himself. It made us smile, very interesting. In fact, I've read his first book, Mapile, and in that I discovered he suffers from this syndrome, which is known as the most interesting person in the world syndrome. And that's because he's lived in so many different places and done so many different things. So my question for Carlo is, can you tell us something about the difference between homeland and home?
Certainly. First of all, the most interesting man in the world syndrome is making fun of those white people who travel the world and visit exotic places and feel special about it. So it's more of a self-ironic nickname than a celebration of being truly interesting, because nowadays it takes a lot to achieve that. Homeland and Home. You know, in this last book, I recounted an episode when I was 16 years old and I left my family and I moved to Pensacola, Florida, and all my friends behind me. And you know, a year later, I started to support myself and pay myself through college. But at the time, in that one first night, I had one episode in which I cried my heart out because I thought I'd never see again my friends and my family, you know, because I was 16. And I had the same experience when I arrived in India in 2007 to study Yoga Ashtanga with Patabi Joyce. And so at the same time, reflecting on this, I quote the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said that a nostalgia is the blank check to the weak mind. And this is what I feel about nationalism as well. I think there is a connection. Because I have taken you for a walk through the different nations that I had the fortune of being a guest of. And I am fortunate to be a guest of India in the last 10 years and have an overseas citizen of India permit to stay here until they take it away. Which they do sometimes if you write things that you shouldn't, like Atish Tazir found out. So as you might know of the case, as an Indian writer whose OCI was taken away, speaking of nationalism. So among the many things that are happening in India today. So what I'm trying to say about nationalism is it finds a different declination in different countries. I can bring the experience of the country where I grew up, of Italy, where nationalism, as it is declined now in Europe, up until 6 or 7 years ago, because of the heritage of fascism and because it was something that Benito Mussolini inculcated into Italians, was seen as something as immature and something that belonged to an era of fanfare and propaganda, and that we were wise enough as European citizens to be proud of our heritage in the Renaissance and to be great inventors and creators and scientists, etc. But we didn't need to cling to that identity necessarily by making other people feel worse. And that we were becoming Europeans, which I think would be something that should be interesting in discussing here, as we were building a European nationalism. Maybe there is some Asian nationalism that is being built, which is much more interesting and much more unifying than characteristic traditional nationalism, because the feeling of belonging and of homeland can be a giant trap to manipulate people and to manipulate masses into a feeling of security and safety, which only hides your own inadequacies. Because it's so easy to not have to face who you are and what you have to prove, and only find in the blanket of, oh, I am that specific nationality, the reassurance that you are worth something. So my feeling of homeland, and it's felt emotionally and strongly with regards to friends, family, and relationship that I have built in different parts of the world, or as we say with my wife, who is Indian, and with whom we travel around, we create home just by being together. So wherever we are that home, or we are that homeland. And you can do that. So I know it's very unfashionable now, because it's the era of sovereignism and nationalism, but I still think that we have taken a reactionary turn that is not in the interest of the development of humanity. So nationalism, especially when it's married to another great storytelling technique called religion, it can be very, very problematic. And I don't think I think it doesn't make any sense even economically, because nationalism became widespread in the 17th and 18th century when it was necessary to have nation building. I'm not saying it didn't have a meaning. In India, it has been extremely important. Independence, kick out the British. Kolkata knows something about that. It has had its very important role. But to manipulate it, to create an identity which is not traditional of the history of this country, for example, or the history of the Italian country as well, which has not been always exclusive, but has been very inclusive throughout the centuries, since ancient Rome, when we had, African emperors, etc., Othello in Venice. So what I'm saying is, this is a phase that we're going through. It's an era that has started about 4 years ago, all throughout the world, in which nationalism is being manipulated, and it's not at the service of the economy either, as we are discovering everywhere in the world.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Saira, you've been at the forefront of the protests against the current bills. So will you tell us what it means and what your protests... Saira is, as you know, a social and peace activist. So your role in these protests.
Thanks, Saaz. Well, we are actually at a brink, where people are actually, they're unable to concentrate on work, because right now, it's a question of nationality. So it's not just fear-mongering, as the government is trying to imply. We've seen in the Nuremberg law in Germany how things panned out. Firstly, you promised them that, look, it's not going to affect you. Ultimately, it did. So the fear here is as real as it gets, because here I'm not speaking as a person with a Muslim identity. I'm here talking on behalf of India as a person who's from an army background. My father served 40 years in the Indian Army, and he's been a 71 war veteran. So for me, identity, nationalism has been living in every part of India, living abroad. So I carry every part of India in me. And at the same time, when you cannot disassociate that it's not a Muslim issue, it is. Because if you look at CAA and NRC, it is divisive. Here you're telling the people that, look, everyone's citizenship will be questioned. And we addressed it in the Assam issue. Right now, Assam is the only state that has implemented NRC, national citizenship. Now what is happening is, under CAA, the people who have been exempted under the under NRC would automatically get citizenship, because it says that the deprived community who are fleeing religious persecution would be allowed to become citizens under CAA, excluding one community. Now, tell me, aren't the Ahmadiyas a persecuted community? Aren't the Shias a persecuted community? So how can you leave out or exempt one section just because the policies have been the minorities of this country. So the fight is all about that, and through certain media channels, this propaganda is being carried out to, so that the citizenry of India perceive this, what you call, the protest as an anti-national movement. It is not an anti-national movement, because there's a difference between being a patriot and being a nationalist. True patriots question, and nationalists follow the regime's orders. So I'm proud to be a patriot today, and I'm proud of the fact that I'm questioning all that is which has an anti-human approach, which is anti-people's approach. And here, what we are doing is we're trying to see that whatever our forefathers promised us in the Constitution, that gets restored. So it's a fight about human rights, it's a fight about restoring our identity that is being snatched every day. So there is an atmosphere of turmoil, there is an atmosphere of despondency. The women in Delhi, if you see in the Shaheen Bagh protests, they're out with their children, there are pregnant women out there who have left their homes. So what joy would they be out on the streets protesting day and night without even a coverage on their heads? They are braving the extreme weather, they are braving the rains, because for them it is a very scary thought. Where do we go? We cannot. We chose, the Indian Muslims today chose a sovereign, socialistic, democratic republic. We did not choose Pakistan. So the issue is, do not bring the Indian community, the Muslim community in particular, on the brink of an unrest, where a civil war could be a possibility. We want peace to be restored back in the country. We do not want strife, and we are working towards working with the people of India so that peace and normalcy is restored. Because at the end of the day, no one likes shouting, screaming, going on protest. However, when you're pushing people to the brink, what choice do we have? We saw in Uttar Pradesh how people were being rounded up. They were silent protesters. They were unarmed. But the brutality that the enforcement agencies actually, put forward on the quiet, unarmed citizens of Uttar Pradesh was exemplary. It was unprecedented and uncalled for. So the fight is all about that. Next few years is going to be crucial, is going to be challenging. However, we are putting in our best foot forward, and hopefully the government, under pressure from all sections of society, all sections of India, would pay heed and listen to the voices of India.
Can
you.
Saaz, may I, Samrat here.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. I just want to, make a small point, which is that while it is true that the law itself is definitely discriminatory and is definitely aimed against a particular community, however, it's not clear that it's going to work as advertised, as you're probably aware. And so, just going back to the Assam experience, in Assam it's not about Muslims, it's the Assamese who are protesting. So it's not a it's not a religious thing at all. And the people who were left out of the NRC, by far the largest number are Bengalis, of Hindu as well as Muslim.
Yeah.
So while there is a religious dimension, the religious dimension is not the only dimension. The Citizenship Amendment Act is probably not going to work as advertised, because if you look at the Joint Parliamentary Committee report, the JPC report, and the IB director's deposition in front of the JPC, 31,000 people would be, given citizenship. Now, for the rest, because there's a cutoff date of December 31st, 2014, you still have to prove that whoever you are, there has to be an application procedure, and you have to prove by some means that you came from such and such country on such and such date. I don't understand how it's going to help anybody at all unless they've actually, at the time of coming, indicated to the authorities that this is where they came from. In other words, if there's somebody who is in India as an illegal citizen, as an illegal migrant from wherever they are, I don't see how it's going to help them unless they've already declared themselves as illegal at the time of entry to some authority, right? It's not going to work as advertised, is what I'm trying to say.
So the thing is, Samrat, no, I agree with that point, because not intrinsically a Muslim issue in Assam. It's about the 1971, also the Assam Accord. So here what is happening is the representatives of the government are announcing time and again that the NRC and CAA would be established across India. Okay, so no matter how much we challenge it, however, if there are government agencies who keep reiterating it through their different media channels that, look, this is the reality, it will be implemented soon, it would be implemented soon, but however, you don't mention one community, you mention all. You mention Jains, Buddhists, X, Y, Z, you leave out one. So tell me, there would be fear, there would be apprehension, and people would be out on the street because if you look at it, it's not ever since 2014.
That's probably the intention.
That is the intention. So 2014, if you see, all the policies have been anti-minority. So you're pushing people to the edge where they would question this.
So before we move on to the next round, do either of you have anything to comment?
I just want to say, in Australia, some people get rounded up and get their identities checked. And there are people that have been in Australia for long periods of time, some short periods of time, who can't prove where they came from or their identities. And in fact, it's their parents. So they were born in Australia, but their parents may have come illegally, or their parents may have come legally, but they now haven't had their births registered. There's a whole range of issues associated with that. How far do you go back to check when somebody actually came to Australia? Because if you actually looked at who came, most people in Australia, other than Indigenous people and the Indigenous people with bloodlines in terms of indigeneity, everybody came from somewhere else in the last 225 years. Everybody's sense of home is actually from somewhere else and has come into Australia, other than Indigenous people in Australia, who, for us with the bloodline, can recount 60, 80,000 years of humanity. So what do we as the Indigenous people say? Who of you, where is all of your identities? Because there are multiple identities over time. So the issue is who gets to ask those questions, how do those questions get asked, and when do those questions get asked? Currently, we have people living offshore on islands who are seen to be refugees in Australia, and we have debates around that. Some of them are Muslims. Some of them are people from other places. Some of them could be people from India. Some of them could be from places, in East Timor or other places. But certainly there are issues for us around addressing refugee status, citizenship status, identity, and how long people have been there or where they get sent back. People do get sent back home. Some people campaign, other Australian peoples campaign to have people stay and remain who've lived here or lived in Australia for generations.
And a very brief note on the fact of Assam and the Northeast, aside from the fact that Australia, they put people on an island and they don't let them out for years if they don't have papers. So they're even more inhuman than in many other parts, and it's recognized internationally, the disgrace that Australia has brought upon itself by treating refugees that way, right? I think you're aware of that. But there is also a problem right here next door, which is the Bangladeshi border. And again, to prove the failure of nationalism in solving an issue like migration, you have a wall here, more or less, the era of walls, that has killed more people than the Berlin Wall, than the Mexican Wall, than any wall everywhere in the world. The Bangladesh-India border has had at least 1,000 people killed over the last 15 years. So there is a gigantic problem. It will not be solved with nationalism because the Rohingya are moving over from Myanmar into Bangladesh. A lot of Bangladeshi have emigrated into India, of course. So it will not ever be solved by closing down and retrenching into nationalism. That's the point I'm trying to make. If we don't go back to a dialogue which is multinational and across borders, it won't be solved. Right now, it looks like a internal problem. The streets of India are filled with protests, but it's not only an Indian problem, it's a global problem. And it's got to go back to that global set.
Thank you so much. Now, I want to ask each of you this. If you could share with us your personal reason for being in the work that you do, and how you got into it and why you're still doing it.
Well, so I had left Shillong. I'm from Shillong, and my parents, my grandparents actually, on both sides were displaced by partition. And so for me, it was actually deeply personal, but I had left Shillong. So I edited newspapers in Delhi, Bombay, and Bangalore. But when I moved back to Shillong is when I actually got really interested in this. I'd started work on this book itself in 2016 when I was in Bombay. And at that time, it seemed that the Northeast had turned a corner. So it seemed that that we were talking about Act East and talking about connectivity, and a lot of buzzwords were being flung about as if the problems of the past had gone away, which I also came to believe. I wrote a piece for the New York Times saying that I think we've turned a corner, basically. And then this thing came about. So 2011 end or 12 beginning. And so it's basically, for me, the work has come about to be deeply, it comes out of personal experience. I grew up during the insurgency in Northeast India, so I saw it firsthand in many cases.
I think for me, as a young woman and as a teenager, watching my parents do community work and work with community organisations, whether they were sports organisations or community organisations or with the schools, in volunteer capacities as well as their paid capacities, instilled in me a bit of a legacy for myself and other family members to carry on some of that work, not necessarily in the same areas, but in other areas, and to continue that work, as well as the ongoing understanding that things aren't right as they are, that it's not right that some people have privileges that they don't earn, that they don't somehow win, but they're just given them because of their birthright or given them because of who they are when they're born within their family. And that's not right. And that other people don't question that. There's a role for all of us to question the privileges that we have, the unearned privileges we have, and how we use those in terms of bringing about change. I also know that in Australia, some of our constitutional work and legislative work and policy work needs a massive overhaul in terms of recognising all people that live in Australia. So I'm actually at the moment joining in with the campaign around trying to get the Uluru Statement. It's one of the reasons I'm wearing hearts today, and I try to wear hearts a lot of days, is because we talk about the sense of the heart of Australia, the sense of changing the hearts and the minds and spirits to think about where we need to be in the future. And I have to have that hope. It's what keeps me driven and what gives me passion, which is about the heart as well. Not talking about romantic heart, I'm talking about our hearts as human beings, about what will the future hold to be an Australian person, male or female, or person in the future. What will it be to be for my grandchildren's future and my grandchildren's grandchildren's future? Because I don't want the same life that I had or my grandparents had or my great-grandparents had. It's got to be better than it has been, and it's got to be better for their lives in the future as well.
Well, I've worked as a journalist for many years, since I was 21 years of age. I was covering what was happening in the ghettos of America in the late 80s and the early 90s for La Repubblica. Then I went into Latin America. I mean, I covered international environmental journalism, Greenpeace, the protests around the world against nuclear testing. And then, in Latin America, I wanted to tell the story to Europeans who were maybe sometimes comfortably eating their Christmas dinner. What was happening in a massacre in Chiapas, for example. I had to reach a massacre in Chiapas during Christmas, I remember a few years ago, or find out what was happening in Colombia. I got shot at the border between Guatemala and Mexico. I had this mission that I thought that I needed to show what was happening to people who were at a more comfortable position and that were probably partially and inadvertently responsible for what was happening over there. But that now as a writer also, with regards to identity, I think that the challenge is even higher because in a moment like this, where we are carrying in our pockets these weapons of mass distraction, we are not able to make meaning anymore and to focus sufficiently into have the deep thought we need to understand what's happening. So as a writer instead, what I think I'm doing with regards to identity, for example, is to try to explain that identity is a story you tell yourself, both collective and personal. And it's very important that you know how to tell that story. And in order to know how to tell the story, you have to read a lot and you have to write a lot. And this is why what we're doing now in a festival like this, which is also to celebrate books aside from discussion, is central to maintaining a sense of reality and meaning. So as a writer, I'm doing this because I'd like to maintain a sense of meaning without losing it in 1,000 fragments.
So, as all people, no one chooses politics. I would say politics chooses you. So a lot of people, it can be all right when they say, oh, I'm apolitical. So I feel situations make people political when people's identity, their livelihood, and everything is at stake. People do take up political causes. So I'm really privileged that in my family, I got to see a lot of community work, especially on my husband's and in-laws side. There was always some by-election or some cause that they were working on. And that's played a huge role in defining the decisions and the calls that I've taken in life. And they've been really fulfilling because I feel that end of the day, if you can be part of or part of a movement that brings about social justice, that somehow makes a great deal of justifying your cause to make the world a better place. So this is where my causes and the calls that are taken life stems from.
Thank you so much. Now, before we open up for audience questions, I want to quickly say something about the Sindhis that I've been studying for the last several years. And the reason I want to do this is because one of the things I've realized is that hardly anybody knows anything about the Sindhis. Even the Sindhis themselves don't know much because when they left their homeland Sindh, they settled in other places so seamlessly and they kind of moved on. So first of all, it was that they lost a lot materially, but, and they of course lost their homeland, which they couldn't go back to, but they also lost so much in terms of culture that it's really shocking when you think about it. It's, they don't speak their language anymore, and they don't even know anything about their literature, the philosophy, and the poetry. They just have no idea. There's this huge abyss there. I'm not a Sindhi. Technically, I'm not a Sindhi myself. I also have a lot of identity issues of my own, but let's not go into that. What I want to say is the Sindhis, when they left Sindh, they did so unanimously. It wasn't just one group of families, but the entire community. They moved out and they settled. They moved on. They never looked back. And it's something which is so admirable that it's amazing that it hasn't been acknowledged and appreciated. And in fact, Sindhis face a lot of prejudice, which is surprising because their contribution to independent India was just extraordinary. I believe that one of the reasons for this was the high level of education in Sindh. And I want you all to know that this passion for education actually came from Bengal in the late 19th century. There were these very passionate young Sindhi men who visited Bengal. They were influenced by the Brahmo Samaj. They were educated here, and they went back taking these ideas of women's education, and those were and of course for higher education. And they very soon made it clear how education could transform society by establishing schools and colleges. And I think this is what actually helped the Sindhis to move ahead the way they have, not just their trading instinct. So that's something that I like to tell people because it's not much known. And now if anyone has questions, please ask.
There's an interesting gentleman, a Sindhi called Shovo Gyanchandani, who remained back in Pakistan and was awarded the highest literary award of Pakistan. So there is also an element because he studied with Rabindranath Tagore under him, and he went back and remained in Pakistan, and he's contributed to the culture and the development of Pakistan. So there is a section of Sindhis who remained back in Pakistan, who did not accept the idea of the two-nation theory by saying that we're going to stay behind. So I'd like to, if you could throw some light on that.
I mean, most of the Hindus in Pakistan actually do live in Sindh. And some of them, when partition took place, the Sindhis actually did not think they were going to have to move because the Hindus had always been a minority in Sindh and they'd integrated extremely well. And when partition took place and there was a displacement and there was greed for property and they were not supported by the government, so most of them just said, fine, that's over now, let's move on and see what happens next. And this is actually a very Sufi way of doing things, you take your situations the way they come and you deal with them and you're practical. I do know some Sindhi families, some Hindu families that stayed on in Sindh. Some of them continued to flourish. I recently met somebody who I interviewed in London, and he comes from Sindhi royalty, in a way Hindu royalty, because it's a long story, so let me just cut this short and say that there are many Hindus who are quite happy in Pakistan, but quite a lot of them also have left over the years, in the last 70 years. Even those who stayed on, and especially after 1971, many of them left. Along the way, there were reasons. There was, in the 50s, there was this thing called One Nation, where all the languages, it was made, it was only Urdu, and people felt colonized. Now there's a lot of this which is in the news, so I don't think I need to add to that. But yeah, there are Hindus in reasonably good positions in Sindh, in terms of in government, as well as in business and in the arts. Mena, you have a question.
I'd like to comment on two things. One, on what Carlo said about nationalism not being the way it's made out to be. When we were younger and in college, a very popular phrase would be to think of us as citizens of the world. It's not a term that's very much in use today, but we used to think, we are Indian citizens, but we are also citizens of the world. But I don't see a trace of that now. And it's all in little compartments. Then the other thing is that we are talking about Sindhis, and I am a Sindhi. And I was, my family moved here after partition. And I was brought up in South India and then in Kolkata. And I have to say that only now, I have realized, especially when I visit my Bengali friends, their inheritance, their memories, their little objects that belong to their great-grandfathers or pieces of furniture that have been in their family. We have none of that. We left everything there. But there's a great awakening in Sindhis about now the role of their culture and other aspects of being a Sindhi. But I think we are the most Indian of Indians because we don't have a state here that we can go and say that we are Bengali or Maharashtrian. Well, we are just Indians, and I prefer it that way.
Thank you so much, Maina. Time is up, but I think there's someone who wants to ask a question, so please go ahead.
This is to Carlo, sir. So you mentioned that nationalism is an identity which is manipulated, and you have been to all over the world, experienced different cultures. So what would you say to the protesters that is who are protesting, be the Assamese or the Muslims or the Jews? What would you say to them? Like they are fighting for their identity.
Yeah.
So
In the end, I think in India you have the fortune of having Vedic thought, which does teach you that identity doesn't exist. So in the end, really, it doesn't exist. So that's important to remember that. It's important also to deal with reality, right? Contemporary materialistic reality in which you have to defend your rights. And in this reality, you have to defend your rights, which are being attacked by an entity that says, I am this, you are not this, so I will attack you. It's normal that you have to react, to defend, not necessarily your identity, but your freedom, which is even more important than your identity. But what I'm saying is, what's dangerous, and some of the Muslim population is falling into that trap here, is to react by retrenching and saying, okay, so then I'm just Muslim and I'm not Indian. But that's a trap. So, oh, then I'm just leftist and I'm not, I think that that's a trap. And I think a lot of people luckily are sending out this message now and saying, fight for your right, because of course you have to and you must. But don't fall into this contradiction of thinking that the majority is against you. The majority has a different identity from yours, because they're probably a lot closer than you might think. That's what I'm saying. Furthermore, to connect to her point about the next step in identity, in Europe, we built a European identity on the rubble of World War II. We learned that it's better for commerce. We learned that it's better for relationship, for culture to be European. And I think that this was also influenced by our economic need to trade more. Asia now is trading more within Asia than with the rest of the world. I bet you, and that's the topic of my next book, that the next step will be, the smart next step is, that will be a growth, which right now we don't see at all, but there will be a growth in Asian identity. So that will be a good identity to aspire towards. It's as a continental identity, which will bring you closer to being a citizen of the world.
You are now staying in Italy, most probably. In
Sorry?
Italy. You are from Italy, I think.
Yes, I'm Italian.
From Spain and its neighbor countries, so many migrants, especially Muslims, they are going to Italy.
Yes.
How your smart government,
Yes.
Italy, is dealing with this citizen?
Yes. Well, it will require an articulate answer that we don't have time for, but I'll just briefly say that we have a newly formed government in the recent few months. The previous government, because of a Ministry of the Interior, dealt with it in an illegal way, and he's being persecuted for it. So the current government has changed the course and has gone back in respective international law. And I think that the respect of international law is very important, to remember why the UN is there, to remember why the deals we have made among nations have to be respected. Those who break them have to be persecuted. It doesn't mean that he won't come back, the Minister of the Interior, to become the next Prime Minister. He might. That's part of the democratic process, so he might. But he'll have to deal with a community of nations if he breaks the law. But if the community of nations, as the plan is to break that community of nations, breaks up, then they can do whatever they want. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying through the event. Thank you so much. Well, if there's any photographer here, can you please click a picture of our guests on... Well, ज़माना ही ऐसा है, pictures के बिना चलता नहीं है. And that's definitely true, because in the current era of digital and social media, photographs are more important than autographs. So as we all saw in the book store out there, in the stall out there, there were more number of photographs taken than the books being autographed. Okay, while the proceedings are being done on the stage, I have one question for all of you. How many of you here don't know Bengali? Or don't know Bengali? Okay, how many of you here don't know Hindi as well? So I'll teach you a line which is very interesting and nice, especially to everyone who don't, who are not very well conversant with Bengali. The line is, Ami tomar ke bhalobashi. Can you guys please try and repeat it? Everyone. Ami. Everyone, can we do it together, please? Ami tomake bhalobashi. It means you guys love me, and thank you so much. Okay, so that's what Kolkata is about. It's about city of joy, city of love, and definitely we are here to spread love and talk about literature.